study session. And we usually start out with public comment on agenda items. Do we have anybody here to comment? Anybody from the public on agenda items? Well, that was fast. Okay. Let's go ahead. Is there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll go forward with that and start out with staff reports with item A.
Thank you, Mayor. So I've got Commander Dave Pickett here to talk about the sex offender registration fee ordinance that we're proposing. Dave is certainly much more knowledgeable and insightful. He'll deny this, of course, than I am on this. But one of the issues that we've noticed over the last few years is we do get a fair number of our sex offenders that are required to register, and we're required to register them that don't pay the fee for registration, and we have no real means of collecting. So I'm going to let Dave sort of walk you through that sex offender registration process and that ordinance and what we're proposing. Dave?
Push the button and the mic is on. All right. As the chief mentioned, currently we have sex offender registration fees. Those are authorized by state statute. Our sex offender fee is at the statutory maximum because we have one registrar who does that work. It's not taken over by a team, and those fees do accurately reflect the resources we put into that particular duty. 2 years ago, there was change in sex offender registration statute that no longer made it a state crime to fail to pay the fee. That was changed to a civil process. Consequently, if we wanted to recoup any unpaid sex offender registration fee, we would have to sue for it. Now, we do have the ability to initiate our own ordinance, and that is what we're requesting to do. In your packet, you had the draft of that ordinance, and it basically says that at the time of registration, the sex offender has to pay the fee. If the fee is not paid at that time, it's in violation of this ordinance, and then a summons will be written for that person to appear in court, municipal court. Now, our proposal is that in the event that the sex offender then shows up in municipal court with the fee, that they can pay that fee and have that case then dismissed. So we're really looking at, as the city budget goes, a fairly small amount of money, about $1,200 to $1,300 a year. But this is also a situation where accountability is important when we deal with sex offenders. These are people who have a tendency to play the system to the best of their ability, and our ability to hold them accountable lets them know that if we're holding them accountable under those circumstances, then the other provisions of registration and sex offender statute will also be enforced. Does anyone have any questions?
So let me just add a couple of things to just Dave's presentation real quick. So that $1,200 to $1,300 probably equates to at least 12 or 13 of the offenders that we have register, depending on the type of registration they're doing. It could be more than that in terms of that, but that gives you a pretty fair figure of what we're talking about. We have, I think, currently right now total registered in the city a little between 120 and 130. Varies month to month as registrations come in and out and people move in and out of our community. The city of Brighton is doing some pretty innovative things when it comes to sex assault investigations and sex offender registrations. And they've had this model in place for a little over a year, I believe. And it seems to be working pretty well. They're getting offenders to to pay. If we do nothing at all, then we're pretty much in a position of not collecting these fees. Doesn't mean that we'll stop processing or stop registering these sex offenders. It just means that we really don't have a collection tool, outside of this ordinance process that's really effective in terms of the amount of time it's going to take us to use it and the amount of money that we're going to collect in terms of it. So, be happy to answer any questions. Dave and I will.
Thank you for putting this together. It looks pretty straightforward. I didn't see if someone doesn't charge, doesn't pay the fee and are charged with a crime of not paying the fee, what is the penalty then for not paying the fee?
Well, the penalty, because of our ordinance structure, it's a criminal misdemeanor, and all of our criminal misdemeanors have the same maximum, which is $999 or 90 days in jail, and then of course it would be up to the judge to make the determination based on the individual case what would be best in that instance.
Is it typical that language is included in the ordinance, or is that because I didn't see it in the ordinance?
No, we don't normally do that in ordinance because all of our criminal misdemeanors have the same fee and jail schedule.
Okay.
So it's set in another section of the code. I can get that code reference, but
Right, the judge knows what it is.
yes, the
He's the
judge
guy.
knows what it is, and it's set by code. So the judge absolutely knows what he can do. And the judge very seldom puts somebody in jail for that full amount or fines somebody the maximum. So
Actually, I guess my question is if registration is constituted by two actions, the filling out of the form and the paying of the registration fee, why wouldn't you not consider it not registered, the person not registered if they haven't paid the fee?
And that's the way the law originally read, was that they weren't fully registered. That language still remains, but when the statute was changed, the criminal, the side of that was removed. What wasn't removed was the language that said we were still required to report the registrant within 3 days. So we still have to go through all of the regular things that we normally would, but we don't have a state statute option for collecting the fee. So,
But what constitutes them as a registrant if they haven't paid the fee?
well, it's a contradiction in the law, but what we would have to do is be able to prosecute that. And it's very clear in the statute that we're not allowed to do that any longer. So there is a contradiction, but in criminal cases, tie always goes to the defendant.
Sure. My thought is you can't get a building permit without paying the fee ahead of time. If you don't pay, it just seems like you wouldn't be able to give them the form. The form costs whatever the fee is, and if you don't pay that, you don't get the form.
And I would love to be able to tell you that there is a logical reason why it is the way it is.
But if
I
you're
would be unable to say that.
it confounds me as to why a sex offender would be threatened by further adjudication. If registering and paying the fee isn't getting them to pay the fee, then what does our addition of a municipal court summons going to add to that?
I can't really tell you how they think, but I can tell you that by Brighton's experience, it took them to 100% compliance. In our experience, what we see is people who are trying to manipulate the system to the best of their ability now, or I should say to the best of their comfort, because these are people who have said, okay, I'm going to register. They haven't said, forget it, I'm not registering.
Right.
All right, but but it's a game.
So if they've chosen to register, but then they've somehow made it in their mind that they're not going to pay that fee, is that because we don't have this mechanism in place? Is that what you're?
What happens at that's an excellent question. At the time of registration, when someone says they don't have the fee, then we provide them with a form. It's actually in your packet, and it is
A lot of those forms out, Dave.
You took
so-
a lot of the
yeah,
forms out, okay. All right. Yeah, and I'm sure everybody would have enjoyed the form. But really, what it is it's a payment schedule, sometimes for as little as $25, that these people sign and say that they're going to do, and then they don't. So then the registrar calls them and says, hey, you owe us this money, and they don't pay, and then the registrar calls them and you owe us this money, they don't pay, and then they come in, and especially those who deregister and go to another jurisdiction, then of course we have no further contact with them.
Well, and that would be my next question related to that is, of those that are not paying, are they remaining in Wheat Ridge as a registered sex offender, or have they left the city?
Both of those situations exist.
And and then as it relates to other cities, can we check across the database of those who haven't paid in other cities to say you need to pay them before you register with us, or adding something like some sort of cross-check in there?
We can say anything we want, but we have no avenue to where there's a judge who'll say you have to do this.
Okay, thank you.
I think the intent of this law probably is to provide a public service with information. It's not about the registration and the process. It's about providing information to citizens. So it's logical that we would do that even if they don't pay the fee. But I want to go back to what's going to happen if they don't pay the fee, because it looks from these figures that the compliance is actually pretty good.
It's fairly strong.
Yeah, and the money involved here is insignificant. So this is, from what you say, all about demanding compliance. But I wonder, are you really wanting to send someone to jail because they haven't paid a $25 fee?
No. What we're interested in doing is letting them know that they're going to be accountable for the entire system.
Yeah, but if they go through the process, in the end, that's what your threat is. And why is this different from the situation that the legislature handled last year, in which they singled out Wheat Ridge as an offender, in which we sent people to jail who couldn't pay for minor fines? And I don't see any difference.
Well, and certainly there are indigent people who cannot pay. We have a certain number of sex offender registrants who are transient as well. But for the most part, our city court has a good track record of gaining compliance. Certainly the Brighton experience and the experience of our registrar is that what these people are interested in doing is gaming the system.
How is this different from the intent of the legislature?
Let me try to answer that for the council member. The particular way the city was dealing with failure to pay and what they called that from a warrant perspective was what needed to change. If people come into court and they continue to fail to pay, we just call it different. It's not called fail to pay and they have to pay before they get out of jail. There's still a warrant that's issued. It's a failure to appear warrant that's issued by the court, and they still have to show up to the judge and explain why they can't pay. The courts go through a process in which they assess, people's ability to pay and how that can be done. And it's no different than any other courts, out there. There was our court, municipal court, and there were several others in the state that, I forget the technical term of what it was called right now. I wasn't prepared for this particular question. But we call those particular kinds of cases something different. So we still go through the process of arresting those people for not paying their fines. It's called a different kind of warrant. It's a different kind of process that the judge has to use in terms of doing that assessment. But the courts have always done an assessment on people's ability to pay and trying to set up a reasonable schedule for those who are indigent and can't pay. And we would apply that here as well. The question is really in terms of this is whether or not it's important to our community that we have a process that holds sex offenders accountable for the costs that are associated with the process that's required to register them. We can continue to go by and not collect fees. I mean, that's certainly an option. We're bringing you a proactive strategy that we think that can hold all sex offenders, accountable, particularly that percentage that, the 12 to 15 or 16 that aren't paying per year, which is about 10% or so of what we're registering per year, and hold them accountable to that payment. And, I can't say what's going to happen to them when they show up in court, if they're going to pay, or if the judge will have to, make a decision on a payment schedule. But it's just a way to hold, offenders, sex offenders, who are a particularly worrisome group in our community, accountable for what they owe municipalities in terms of that cost to register. So, it's we can continue to do business the way that we've done business and not collect those fees. I think, if we track it over a course of years, if people find out they're not paying fees and not being held accountable, we'll probably start to see a trend. It's not going to happen overnight, but we'll start to see a trend where more and more aren't. Or we can take this strategy and see how it works. And if it's working, that's great. We'll leave it on the books. If it's not working, we may want to tinker with it or just throw it off. We've got an ordinance on the books right now that says that we fine violators of unverified alarms. We haven't done that for years. I mean, it was a strategy that was used in the 80s and 90s by a lot of law enforcement agencies as a means to offset, the costs of silent alarms. Didn't work. It cost you more to track than it was worth. So we changed and went on a different strategy and went in a different direction. But I certainly understand your concerns.
The actual registration process, what I'm trying to really ascertain is no matter what, whether they pay or not, the information is still made public.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We're required by
So
state
it's
law.
not a way that they can wiggle out of
No,
that. Okay.
no.
So
No,
the
we're
question
required by
is,
the law to do it.
and I'm hearing a couple of sides of it, the question is being whether that accountability is what you're looking for, responsibility for this, for these individuals versus sensitivity. Mr. Starker, you had something to say.
I do. It looks to me like it's the difference between a civil crime and a criminal offense in our city. And I assume that right now we don't file suit against these individuals in civil court to try to recover the costs that it takes us to register them. Is that right?
That is correct.
And I assume that if we were to look at the cost of filing suit against these people in civil court, as opposed to the cost of an issuance of a citation, it would be vastly more economical for the city to issue a citation in order to achieve a level of compliance.
That is true. In addition, the judge has options other than fine and jail. So, and can, and often does take advantage of that. And so, again, it's a question of accountability rather than, necessarily getting, we may not get 100% of our fees under this system, but what we would get is a system where we could at least attempt to hold people accountable.
And this,
I think that, excuse me.
Go ahead.
But I think the judge has testified before that he's tried those other methods and that they haven't worked. that people who don't pay for whatever reason, are they're given other options and they don't pay then either. So I'm still wondering at the end of all this process, what's going to happen? Because is it an empty threat or not?
Well, I mean, certainly, I don't see necessarily the judge, although I can't make any promises about what he can do with his authority. I don't see him as using jail time necessarily as an important part of this. However, it could be a cumulative issue. So if this person is not abiding by other sections of the registration laws or by other sections of city ordinance, then this is one more thing that allows the judge, whether it's in the state system or in the municipal system, to make a determination about what should happen to this person.
Yes, that brings me to my next question. How many of the current registered sex offenders in Wheat Ridge are on parole or under some type of continuing supervision?
I don't have the exact number, not nearly as many as you might think.
Okay. I guess because that would be my question as to if someone has not maintained their obligations to the city or to whomever, then that could be a parole violation of some kind. And then
We have very little problem collecting from people who are on parole or probation.
it's those that have exited the system completely but continue to. And then there was another question along those, but that's okay. I'll just.
Mr. Starker?
Well, I think it's a reasonable approach that the city make this go from a civil adjudication to a criminal adjudication. I think the cost-benefit of analysis is fair and equitable, and I would make a motion that we move this forward to the city council for further consideration.
Do we have a consensus on that?
Yeah.
We do.
Thank you.
Where's your answer?
Okay, so we'll bring that forward at a future council meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Are you again?
I'm again.
You're again.
I'm here all night.
You know, I forgot to mention that 3 of our members will not be present tonight. 2 of them we all knew about, but Ms. Langworthy called me earlier this evening and said she couldn't make it. Okay.
So just a short staff report on an amendment the police department city attorney is proposing for section 16156, interference with public officers performing their duties. Last year in 2014, we had an arrest situation that caused me to be a little bit concerned in regards to our officers' knowledge of when they can make arrests for I guess you'd call it civil disobedience, but what would be perceived as harassment or disorderly conduct. And we were able to get that resolved. But one of the things I thought was important was that we did a training bulletin to our staff, so sort of a refresher of what U.S. constitutional law and state constitutional law required. And a part of that was to ask the city attorney's office to review section 16156 and determine if the language that was in there was still correct. It had been a while, a number of years since that particular section has been amended. So Jerry Dahl in, I think it was October, November, mentioned this to council during city attorney matters, and you gave him some direction to move forward on this particular ordinance and do the revision. So we've been working with Ms. Carmen Berry to look at 16156 and make some changes to that. So I've attached the proposed revision, and essentially what the revision does is it removes subsection B of the ordinance, and then adds some of that language to subsection C in terms of when a police officer can charge this particular section, and it brings it into alignment with current U.S. constitutional laws pertains to Terry stops, which are reasonable suspicion stops that a police officer might do, what a police officer can ask of a person while acting under his official color of authority, and ascertaining a person's name, date of birth, and those kinds of things. So some relatively minor changes, but they took what was an overly broad ordinance and they defined it a little bit, and will allow us to do some training with our officers on this particular charge. So I'd be happy to try to answer any legal questions that council might have in regards to that.
Council comfortable with the changes or wish to ask some more questions? Up, I see a hand up. Mr. Starker.
Chief, in here, it would seem to me that the three elements that you're, and I'm looking at what is the new bullet point B, and I assume this is directed at only, this could apply to any member of the public, correct? This is not someone who has been stopped. This is any member of the public, and the three things that you are by constitution allowed to collect are name, address, and age.
So what this particular ordinance puts in place is an officer has to have reasonable suspicion to stop somebody. I can't just stop anybody, so I couldn't look at you, Bud, and say, I'm going to stop Bud because, he's an elderly, white male who I think might be up to something. I've got to be, and no offense with any of that reasoning, okay? But
You got me an elderly.
so a younger, partially bald male with gray hair, but
You may have just precipitated it.
but I couldn't just stop you. I'd have to be able to articulate a reason to stop you. So that's what this sets in place. And then the interference piece of that comes when because the law allows you to ask certain kinds of questions, get a response. Your name, it's covered in here in regards to identifying information, and it also gives you some ability if you get somebody who intends to give you false information in regards to their name and date of birth. So we deal with this a lot. We'll make arrests out there for failure to appear warrants, and it turns out it's a sister or a brother or a friend that used their name and information. So it gives us the opportunity to charge within that. So it's all under color of authority. So I have to do it in my authority as a police officer. It has to be a reasonable suspicion kind of stop. So I have to be able to articulate. It's not a probable cause that would require an arrest. I might have to articulate, why am I stopping this person? So it's in an area, it's a high crime area, it might be late at night, they're behind a building, their movements or their actions are sort of designed to avert their attention from me. So there's a variety of different ways that we operate within that. But it's essentially, it's late at night, you're hiding behind a building, what are you doing? Give me your name and your information and those kinds of things. And when they lie about that and we can prove it, we can charge them with this particular thing, or if they're intentionally interfering with that investigation. And we have to prove that to a standard that we can make an arrest, and certainly prove it to a standard where, a municipal city attorney, or, if we charge the obstruction charge, which is the state charge, that our DA's office could charge.
I had a follow-up, if I may. And does this address or change any of the circumstances where another adjacent party is taking a video and filming the incident? Does this have any implication into that type of activity?
No, we'll be filming interactions, and they can film interactions as well. We've had a number of situations where our officers have made contact with citizens, and somebody pulls out a camera and starts videotaping those. You can actually go to YouTube and Google Wheat Ridge PD, and you can pull up some of those. And our officers are always, acting professional, and, you know, in response to asking questions and in terms of what's going on and what they're doing. So it doesn't have anything to do with that at all.
Mr.
My question is on that new Part C, there's a phrase in there, to knowingly refuse to reveal. Why is it to knowingly?
So that's a legal term. It's a part of the intent clause that we have to approve. So as part of that, we have to show. So the legal term is knowingly. You know, I stop you on the street and you give me Councilmember DiTullio's name.
I do that all the time.
Well, somebody's doing it. So because you know, I'm getting calls all the time. So as part of that, you know, that would show that you were knowingly giving somebody else's name. You know, just the mere act of doing that, but that's a legal
It
term
just
that's
seems
in
like
there.
that there's an assumption there that how could you not knowingly give a false name, address, or age?
Right,
That, as soon as you do that, you've
right.
done
So
it.
if you look at a lot of Colorado Revised Statute or our ordinances, you know, though, I call them those intent
Right.
kinds of clauses, knowingly, willingly, recklessly, intentionally, you know, kinds of things that you'll see in there, and that's the particular term they use for this.
My only concern with that, and I get the logic behind it, is that it creates some sort of loophole for someone that says, well, I didn't know I was giving them a wrong name. I was too drunk or too inebriated to give the right name, or that the person then is able to wiggle their way
So
out.
there are some affirmative defenses that are available, and I was too intoxicated might be one of them, but they have to prove that to the judge, and not to us necessarily. So that's one of those things that we deal with. I mean, it's part of what we need to prove in a case.
So if we're comfortable with this, I need a, thank you.
Well, I would make a consensus that we move this forward to the dais for review.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we'll be bringing that forward as well. So I'm going to transition.
Okay. We're now going to, our last item item number 2 actually is code enforcement strategies. Oh, there, Mr. Johnston.
So as council remembers, is one of your goals from your strategic planning retreat, you had asked and directed staff to look at the issue of code enforcement, to see what we could do that was in addition to what we're doing today. So on August 4th of 2014, we brought to you some general outlines of what staff thought we could do in terms of that, and that memorandum from that particular meeting is attached, and it sort of gave you an overview of code enforcement in the city, you know, since our inception and what we've been doing, in particular the last 10 years, as it pertains to code enforcement and addressing some of those issues in the city. So you had asked and directed Ken and I on the 4th to come forward with some proposals that you could look at and make decisions in regards to additional code enforcement efforts in the city. And I'm going to get into those. There's 3 approaches in particular that we recommended, but I thought it might be helpful first to do a short presentation as it pertains to what code enforcement looks like in the city currently, and to give you a little bit of data. So my crime analyst put together a really lengthy PowerPoint that really got into a lot of data. I've shortened it for the purposes of this meeting to sort of give you that executive summary, that executive overview of what code enforcement looks like in the city. And I've also brought Jim and Mary McKenna, our community services supervisor, to answer those questions you might ask me that I can't. So let's see if I can get this thing to sort of work here. So we're stuck on this slide. So here we go. So the first slide here, 2 smiling code enforcement officers out there, you know, doing their code enforcement, animal control, and park stuff. But the purpose of the slide is really to sort of give council an overview of what nuisance code enforcement looks like. And as you can see there are 4 particular chapters of the City Code of Laws that code enforcement deals with. Nuisances, which is a lot of the trash, the blowing dust, the weeds, defacing property, unlawful activities, unlawful acts, a condition of stable fertilizer in buildings. But it's really the bulk of a lot of the code enforcement activities we deal with. Chapter 16, which is really the criminal code section of our city code of laws, has two subsections in it that deal with dangerous containers. So somebody that leaves a refrigerator without removing the door, an ice box, those kinds of things, and obstructing streets and sidewalks, which is really the, pushing snow out into the streets and doing those kinds of things. The vegetation is under Chapter 24, so this is trees and shrubs, it's nuisance plants, it's weed and tall grass control. And then Chapter 26, the zoning and development chapter, when we took over the property inspector position, and actually we did some enforcement in this, but really when we got that property inspector position several years ago, we took the bulk of the nuisance kind of code stuff that was in Chapter 26. So fences, walls, obstructions, residential parking, parking of tractor trailers, condition of parking lots, signs, lighting, occupancy limits all sort of fell under our authority to act on. So a pretty diverse group of ordinances to look at. The next slide sort of gives you an overview of all of our nuisance code enforcement activities. And what's included in the total up here is everything that I've listed on the previous slide, but about 17% of the total in these years, for the most part, not every year, but about 17% of that's defacing properties. That's the graffiti kinds of stuff. And our community service officers really don't deal with the graffiti piece. We do a lot of that. Parks helps us with that, graffiti in the parks. They will get the basic information, give it to our telephone reporting unit, and they'll do the actual report on that. Or Public Works will go out on traffic control signs. They'll report what they've found, and both Parks and Public Works tries to get that removed as quickly as they can. And then our patrol officers will handle some of that when a fence or cinder block structure gets spray painted with graffiti. They handle that, so it's a part of our nuisance code, but it's separate and distinct from what we really deal with from a code enforcement perspective, unless it's a real problem location. But what you can see here, and what this tries to break down, is how many violations in each of these years are cited in Chapter 15, 75, 24, and Chapter 26. And it gives you a pretty good idea from looking at, as you look at it from year to year, those increases that you see year to year, particularly in the last 3 years, since we've added our seasonals and increased our seasonals from 3 to 7, you start to see some increases, and you'll see some more significant increases later. So about 83% of everything that we do is out of chapter is non-defacing properties. So this gives you an idea of what we're dealing with there. Here it gives you just a little bit different snapshot of that, our top nuisance code violations per year. And it shows those for 2012, 2013, and 2014. It shows number 1 through number 5. But if you look at that, what I pulled out of that is if you take defacing property out of what we're doing out there, our top issues are littering, weed control, unlawful activities, controls of trees and shrubs, and unlawful acts. So let me talk about unlawful activities, unlawful acts, because people get confused. Even I get confused on that. And Mary will correct me if I get this wrong. But the unlawful activities is a lot of that. There's about A through K in that section that deals with storage issues, junk issues, debris issues, those parking of vehicles, too many vehicles. If you've got a vehicle that needs repair, you can have one vehicle per residence that if you have in your property doesn't have to be licensed, those kinds of things. But if you have 2 or 3, that would be a violation of that particular ordinance. So it's pretty broad, but it's a lot of storage kinds of things. And then the unlawful acts is the exterior of a house. So peeling paint, gutters, screens, windows, those kinds of things where you've really got maybe a distressed property. So it's not just houses, but we use unlawful acts a lot when we're doing our property inspections of our hotels and motels. And that's a citation. We'll often cite because they don't have screens on windows, the windows are broken, those kinds of things. So we use that a lot. So that, if you didn't know what those were, and sometimes we get angst, even from some of you in regards to, well, an unlawful act sounds like I've committed a crime, but it's really how those things have been defined. And I guess we could look at another way of calling some of those. They certainly work for us because we know what they mean. We try to explain those to citizens. But this would give you an idea of what an unlawful act might look like in terms of a residence, and certainly you got some weed issues and some shrubbery issues there as well that you deal with. So this gives you an idea, and the thing that really came up in 2014 is you start to see unlawful acts as one of the top 5, and that's partially because of the training that we gave to our CSOs as it pertained to property maintenance issues and the fact that we increased our seasonals from 3 to 7. So they were really focused on those particular kinds of issues. This past year, trees and shrubs kind of dropped off of that from 2014. We still dealt with them, but they weren't in our top 5. So this is the heat map. So I've shown you some heat maps in the past in regards to crime and traffic kinds of things. So here's your heat map for all of those nuisance code issues that I showed you previously. And so you'll see 2012, 2013, and 2014. That's pretty, and these are annual, so this is all throughout the year. So that's a pretty intensive map there. But you'll see, some consistencies here. In 2012, in 2013, and in 2014, you tend to see that the southeast part of the city is one of our areas of focus. And I'm going to give you some stats in regards to why that is, but certainly East Wheat Ridge has played a role in that because we've really focused, in that particular area. So all of the blue dots are sort of your Chapter 15 nuisance. Gray dots, and there's not many of them up there, are your Chapter 16 offenses. Your light lime green dot is vegetation, and Chapter 26, your zoning and development. Dots are, and you'll see a number of those scattered throughout the city, are your zoning and development kinds of violations. So what you've got here is pretty much, District 1 and 2 on the east side of the city is, and particularly the southeast area of the city, is a high-intensity area, and a lot of that is because of what we're doing with East Wheat Ridge. It's that focused effort to address some of the crime, traffic, and quality of life issues, and so these are the quality of life issues. And then you see, certainly, you can see a growing trend along the Kipling corridor, particularly between 38th and, I-70, and that area along 44th Avenue, or what we call the Boyd's Crossing area. And this is an area that is another community policing project, and we're trying to gather some data. It's a real challenging area because it's commercial, it's hotel, motel, and it's residential. So we have some unique challenges in this area that aren't similar to what we've faced in the East Wheat Ridge area. So this kind of gives you just an overview of what code enforcement efforts today look like. So here are hotspots for citizens. So one of the things I asked my crime analyst to do was, I said, let's break out a map that shows, overall hotspots, but how many of these are citizen complaints, where citizens are actually calling us and either our communications center or doing a service request and saying, we want you to deal with things. So if you looked at this map, and it's sort of blown up compared to the previous map, but if you look at this total and then look at this, we're not getting a whole lot of citizen complaints about code enforcement. We are getting some, as you can see, and they sort of match up. The colors look different because the numbers on this map look different than the numbers on the other map, but they're pretty similar. This east side of the city, what I call sort of the east central part of the city, and then the Kipling corridor, 44th Avenue corridor there are pretty consistent in terms of citizens calling the police department or community services and saying, we want more code enforcement, or they're calling you asking for that. This is what your hotspots look like for officer-initiated calls for service. So you can see that we are more proactive than reactive when it comes to code enforcement. Our officers are out there doing more nuisance code enforcement than we've done in the past. And we're really trying to be fairly strategic in regards to what that looks looks like in terms of the resources we have. But certainly the Chapter 15 nuisances are the predominant nuisance up here, followed by vegetation and probably zoning and development issues. And then here, this slide, which is the last slide, gives you sort of the origination of nuisance code enforcement. So in 2014, 23% of nuisance code violations were reported by citizens. So that tells you as council that, 77% of what we're doing out there from a code enforcement perspective is our community service officers. And I think the other reason why that is so high is we've made that transition in 2014 to 7 seasonal community service officers to assist the 5 community service officers that we have now. So we're able to do just a lot more work than we've been able to do in the past. And then sort of a breakdown here in regards to, those priorities. So as I mentioned earlier, weed control is number 1. Littering, so littering is signs. It's not somebody throwing a cigarette butt out of a car. That's generally the complaints about, political signs is always a biggie around political season. But, people that put up signs for, garage sales or, signs, I can sell your house, refinance your house, call me, those kinds of things that, that are stuck up. And those generally tend, quite frankly, to be at major intersections. So we see 32nd in Youngfield, 38th in Youngfield, 32nd Sheridan, and 38th in Sheridan are primary areas where we see a lot of those signs. They're scattered throughout the city, but those tend to be where those congregate. As I touched on, unlawful activities, unlawful acts, in terms of what we deal with there, and those numbers are pretty consistent. And then defacing property, which that number's actually gone down last year. I can't tell you why. It sort of rides a cycle. It could be way up next year, but we saw less reported defacing property last year than we've seen in previous years. So, did you have something you wanted to say? No? I did an awesome job then. All right. So, no other slides. See that? So I promised you 7 slides. Tried to keep it short. So let me transition down here. Yeah, I'd give you a copy of that too, Gino. So actually, I've got copies here. I don't know why I didn't give these to you. So if any of you would like a copy of this one to look at it in more detail, you could certainly do that. I'm sorry, I should have given those to you. So here's what staff did after we met with you on August 4th is Ken and I started to meet with our staffs. We met twice a month, and to sort of cover, and try to come to some consensus and some proposals that we could give to you as it pertained to code enforcement programs. So, to start the process, we went through, we did some literature review, we looked at our ordinances, we looked at our current processes to see if there were any changes that we wanted to make or recommend to you. So we really tried to do, a good job in terms of looking at what we were doing. We looked at our functions, we looked at the manner in which we handled calls for service. We looked at our administrative model process and pretty much came to the conclusion that absent maybe some minor adjustments to ordinances and stuff, what we had was currently workable and that we could move forward with that. And then we sort of, I call it chalkboarded, what we're doing today. So we tried to look at everything that we were doing from a reactive or a proactive perspective as it pertained to code enforcement, and thought that we'd try to capture that. So we captured that under our current nuisance code strategies. So we really talk about what we're doing today to sort of address some of the citizen and elected official concerns that we have. So, our East Wheat Ridge project, our dumpster program, spoke a little bit about our budget, the seasonal CSO program, and what we noticed in 2014 is adding those, going from 3 seasonal CSOs to 7, really helped us address two areas, nuisance code enforcement and parks safety. By having two of those seasonal CSOs assigned to our parks, particularly some of our problematic parks, we were able to resolve a lot of community issues. So that was a good thing. The city's had this large item pickup program they do on an annual basis for 275 Wheat Ridge residents. You know, they didn't get 275 residents that used it last year. They got right over 100 that took advantage of that, but we still thought it was a pretty good program. To mention, we've used education and media quite a bit to try to promote what we're trying to do, what your direction has been in terms of code enforcement in the city. And so we've used all of our written stuff, developed Cody the Code Ranger program. We use him a lot in both code and animal control and a lot of our parks enforcement and even some of our bicycle safety stuff. It's been really a positive thing. And then pushing stuff out on the city's website, connections, Mayor's Matters, social media on our Facebook, and tweeting information out are all positive steps that we've taken to try to educate you know, our community in regards to what the issues are. We've got, I think, a pretty proactive program to work with our seniors. So a lot of the folks, and I could give you a half a dozen examples off the top of my head, that we run into sometimes can't take care of their properties because they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they're just not physically able to do that, and they don't have, you know, the support to do that. So we have worked with our Senior Resource Center, you know, the Live Well Wheat Ridge, the Jewish Family Services, all in our local churches, particularly Crossroads, to help us address some of those issues and to provide some services, if it's mowing a lawn, if it's removing junk and debris, cutting down a tree, maybe painting a house. We're trying to use those. Jewish Family Services has, as part of their grant to assist seniors, has a contract with Brothers Construction, and have been able to use them a little bit to help seniors, you know, spruce up their place a little bit and do that. We've got a pretty good, as I've mentioned, just from those names, we've also worked well with Wheat Ridge 2020 and the Jefferson County Housing Authority, a couple of our local churches, and Dr. Cog on some of the issues that we face and address. And the other thing that we do from a city perspective that I think it's important for our elected officials to know is we meet with community development and public works on a monthly basis. It's called an issues group. So oftentimes when we go out to deal with a nuisance code enforcement violation, there is another violation that pertains to community development that might fall within the purview of zoning or the building inspector, or it might be a stormwater issue. So by having all the parties there, we're able to talk about specific properties and strategies in terms of trying to gain compliance and to work with those folks. And the other good thing is it's then the city speaking with one voice, oftentimes, or at least representatives from 3 of those different areas. In the past, what we'd oftentimes see is one area of the city would deal with their issue and not the other 2 issues, and oftentimes citizens would get confused on who they were supposed to call, who they were supposed to deal with, or they get conflicting information on how to deal with this. So this got all of the parties at one table to talk about issues and address those. And we're not making a recommendation to change any of this. We think that this is all a positive, proactive strategy. There certainly may be some things under the program approach that Ken and I will touch on here in a little bit that we could strengthen in regards to this. But we think all of these things are really working. We think they're really positive. So we then got to the position of talking about what kinds of alternatives do we have that that exists today that we could use to enhance nuisance code enforcement in the city. And I noticed on the memo that you got that approach number 1 wasn't listed in here, so it was probably a little confusing. So approach number 1, in terms of what we talked about, really dealt with staffing. So we talked about what would it look like if we added full-time staffing to this, and where would we need that full-time staffing? Where would that reside? What would it look like? And if you add more staff to our community services team, then at some point it really starts to impact community development, because a lot of what we look at, particularly from a commercial nuisance code violation, requires research into existing agreements as it pertains maybe to landscaping or lighting and those kinds of things. And it really takes somebody that is zoning focused and understands their system of keeping records and how those records are recorded to do that. So there could come certainly a point where, you know, if you added more staff to you know, the police department's community services team, where it'd really start to have a negative impact on Ken's team. So we decided that we really needed to take an approach that gave us some flexibility and gave council some flexibility moving forward. So what we're proposing to do is right now, today, in 2014, for instance, council gave us authorization to hire 7 seasonal community service officers. And those folks, we try to get them onboarded in late April and in early May, but the reality is a lot of these kids are in school, they're going to college, and they're really not available to us until a May time frame, or a June time frame. So the last couple of years, we've really gotten these folks onboarded the 1st of June, and we've got to, when we have new employees, we've got to get them trained in the ordinances and how to do investigations. So it takes us a little while to get up to speed there. So what we're proposing to council is, instead of hiring a new full-time equivalent to help the community services team, is let's take 2 of these seasonal positions. So we got 7 seasonal positions that work essentially, you know, we try to have them on board from May through about September, you know, the growing season. And let's take 2 of those positions and let's make them year-long contract positions. So if we were to make these part-time benefited positions, it would really add a significant cost from a benefits perspective. It's almost the equivalent of a full-time employee. It's a pretty significant cost for benefits. But there is a process that the city personnel policies allow us to do, is to offer what's called a contingent position or a contract position. And we could identify, you know, our hope would be to identify 2 of our current seasonals. We know that some of the seasonals that we had last year want to come back, and actually some of them wanted to continue working, you know, just as seasonals for as long as they could. Let's see if we can use and leverage 2 of these seasonal positions, make them contract positions where we had them for a full year, and focus their efforts and training certifications and their efforts in 2015 to working on what we're going to call our problem-solving, you know, approach. And we could focus them on, you know, 3 areas of the city, or 4 areas that we really wanted them to work on. So what we're proposing is that we keep our East Wheat Ridge project, because there's still work to be done in that area of the city, and that we identify 2 other residential areas in the city, neighborhoods preferably, small, you know, neighborhood areas much like East Wheat Ridge, that we could really focus our efforts. And our recommendation is sort of in District 2 and 4, but you know, that you may have thoughts or considerations in areas that you see that you'd rather see us focus our efforts on, and we're certainly open to that. And then let's identify 1 commercial area, not a, you know, a whole length of roadway, but 1 commercial area that we could really think that we could make a difference. So we've recommended 2 particular areas to council, but we're certainly willing to entertain you know, your thoughts on that. But 44th Avenue from Harlan to Wadsworth, or the Wadsworth corridor from about 35th to about 48th Avenue, that we could work, because that's going to be an area of focus for the city moving forward with this Pell study and of environmental assessment that the city's looking at doing. So one of those 2 areas that we could look at. And what our focus would be is we would give Mary the authority to delegate her full-time staff to working with these 2 part-time staff members in these 4 areas. So East Wheat Ridge, 2 other neighborhood areas, and a commercial area, to see if we could have an impact. And then the problem-solving approach that sort of dovetails into approach number 1, if you prefer that approach of 2 contract employees. So if it doesn't work, we can say, hey, your contract's up and we're not able to move forward, is we want to use a problem-solving approach. So what we're proposing is that we work with our crime analyst and the city's GIS analyst and members from community development and the police department to meet on a monthly basis to look at these targeted areas to see what kind of impact are we having. So at the end of 2015, first part of 2016, we could come back to you with some data that says, hey, this works, and here are some things that you might want to consider for 2016. Here are some things that don't work. And here's what we need to, maybe do to massage this, or we need to change our strategy. Our strategy throughout all of these processes is very similar to what we've used with East Wheat Ridge. It's a carrot, I call it the carrot and stick approach. You identify an area, you go in there and you knock on doors, you give people literature and information on what the violations are in that particular area, what they can do to clean that up, what the ordinance violations look like, what will happen to them if they don't make those necessary changes and modifications to their quality of life. We'll look at providing dumpsters in those particular areas, and so they have the opportunity to clean up. And then what that does then is give us the opportunity to do the positive, proactive stuff, and then we can come in and deal with the people that we just didn't get their attention the first time. And we can use our administrative model process to start to deal with those, or as a last resort, and we only use it on a few occasions every year, our nuisance abatement process to abate properties. So that process would work really good for neighborhoods. We'd do community meetings, we'd talk about the program, we'd talk about what we're trying to do, we'd talk about our goals, and get that done. Similar kind of process with our commercial areas, but it would require a little bit more data in regards to that. So we'd really have to do an assessment at the beginning of that, of what are our problems in this particular commercial area? What do we need to address? What are the major violations? And then really outreach, to our community partners, whether that's the Wheat Ridge Business, Association, Wheat Ridge 2020, maybe it's the if we do 44th Avenue, it's the 44th Avenue Business Association, and start to talk about what we're trying to do from a city perspective and start to lay that process out. And look, I think, in our commercial areas for minimal wins initially, because I think a lot of the work that we may need to do down the road is going to involve, a program to provide some incentives beyond what we're currently providing to business owners to clean up our get those properties cleaned up and looking like we would like them to look like from an attractive city, perspective. So if we add these two positions, I've outlaid what those costs will look like. It's about $28,000 more annually a year per to add those two contingent employees to the money that's currently budgeted today. We have right about 80,000, just below 80,000 currently budgeted for next year for our 7 seasonals. And with our 5 other seasonals, we'd continue to do what we did this past year with them. We'd use them for parks, and we'd continue to use them for residential nuisance code enforcement in all of our districts. The one challenge that we'll have when we had this year, and we'd asked council for a vehicle that got cut from the budget, is we've got to give these people some equipment to use and some vehicles to use. What we had asked for last year was another CSO vehicle that would have been outfitted with all of the animal control equipment that's currently in our current CSO vehicles. And to be quite frank with you, a lot of that equipment's almost as expensive as the vehicle, to put all of that in there. So what we've done is talked about, what could we best use? And frankly, we could use just about any kind of vehicle. It could be a sedan, or a small pickup. We thought a small pickup would give us the best utility with a camper shell on that. We'd get it outfitted, with emergency lights and police radio and a computer, which we currently have in all of our vehicles except our unmarked vehicles, and we would put minimal equipment in there from an animal control perspective. But we would be able also to use that vehicle in our parks, and we're oftentimes driving the Greenbelt and some of our other parks. So we'd like a vehicle that would have enough clearance to get through some of the gates that we currently had. Lost an oil pan on a marked car here a couple months ago that didn't quite have the clearance, to get over that locking mechanism on one of the gates. So we want a vehicle that has that clearance, and it doesn't need to be a four-wheel drive. It could be a two-wheel drive. So there's a third approach that we want to talk about. I've asked Ken to sort of cover this because it sort of falls in his bailiwick, which is sort of that revitalization program that we might want to look at in 2016 based on some of the data we get in 2015. So Ken?
Thanks, Dan. Approach number 3 is really just, I think, an extension of approach number 2 in terms of this problem-solving approach, identifying corridors, and just getting more systematic in your approach and making sure that it's holistic, so that you have a real robust education and outreach. Why are we doing this? Where are we doing this? What are our goals? What are our bigger picture goals in terms of, as Dan alludes, we have economic development goals. We have potentially a major street reconstruction on Wadsworth if that, federal and state and local project moves forward. So just articulate that this is all about a bigger picture. And that code enforcement is part of that, but it's also part of just a broader community revitalization. We're not picking on you. We have big picture goals for the city. I think there's some good models out there of, we keep coming back to one in Cincinnati, Ohio, which has been in place since about 2008. It's won awards. It's well funded, and I think they use community development block grant funds, which they have access to in a different way than we do as a community, because ours are controlled by Jefferson County. But they have a very focused approach where they identify 2 neighborhoods in the community, and they do amped up code enforcement in a fairly significant way. But then they do grassroots things like taking over a vacant lot and having a real grassroots way of repurposing that for maybe a urban garden. Maybe they'll paint a facade of a vacant house. And then bigger investments, like the city typically will make an investment in terms of the infrastructure in the region. So maybe you're making drainage improvements in that neighborhood at the same time. So as well as potentially expanding, as Dan alluded to, maybe the grant program, so that if a private property owner wants to make improvements to the exterior of their property or the exterior of their building, something that would be a physical and visual attraction to the area, that there would be grants or loan programs available as well. So I think it's really just taking what we're doing and what we are talking about expanding doing in 2015 to the next level, and really having a true programmatic approach. I think the challenge for us, and why we think it's maybe premature to come forward with you on a recommendation for that in that regard in 2015, is that we don't have a good sense of how resource intensive that's going to be. Obviously, if you get, you start talking about making infrastructure improvements or expanding grant programs, we can certainly utilize some of our existing programs and focus those in certain areas. And we work with the Wheat Ridge Business District and Wheat Ridge 2020 in focusing those programs. But the infrastructure investments, that's a little different nut to crack. And then the staff resources. We are, I think Dan's changes that he's proposing in terms of the contract or contingent employees is a good one, in my opinion, to kind of test the waters and to get some resources that are clearly focused in this area and not spread thin, as we alluded to in the report, in terms of doing animal control and parks enforcement as well, but really get them focused on this nuisance code issues. But in addition to that, as Dan suggested, I mean, the role of the planning department when it comes to looking at particularly commercial corridors, when you start looking at landscape plans that have to be researched, potentially agreements that were made off the side, or subdivision agreements, or final development plan, land use approvals. You've got to cross-reference all those documents. And you've got to do it comprehensively, right? You can't just pick on one property owner. If you're going to go out on Wadsworth, you've got to go out on Wadsworth, right? And you've got to be able to tell, Joe Blow, who you're enforcing something on, that yes, I'm doing it to Mary Blue next door too. And you count on that we're working on this in a comprehensive manner. And yes, I'm knocking on your door today, but we're knocking on all the doors as needed to address the specific issues that we're trying to address. So having said that, I think we're going to use 2015, it's our intent at least, to test those waters, to refocus some of my department's resources towards this effort, but then see how impactful that is, see how much impact we can make without new positions, but just kind of taking existing positions and carving out a certain portion of their time to work on this approach number 2 that Dan has outlined. So I think that's all I've got, Dan.
So thanks, Ken. So one of the plans is just look at this data that I've presented to you and to meet with my community services team to have a discussion about if we could identify 2 other neighborhoods in the city, in the north part of the city and the west part of the city, what would those areas look like? We've already got this community policing project that we geared up at the beginning of last year, this Boyd's Crossing area, which is really sort of that 44th Avenue, I-70, Kipling to Garrison corridor, and that's certainly one area that we've looked in. But we also want to hear from you. If there's a particular area that you can come to consensus on that you would like us to address, we'd certainly look at that, because you get the most calls from your constituents in regards to what we have. So at the end of all of this, in terms of recommendations, the ask is, we'd like to take 2 of our seasonal positions and make them year-long contract positions, and that would require a budget supplemental in the amount of about $27,000 to pay them, $16 an hour, for the work that they do over the course of the year. We already have some money, $78,000 in our current budget right now for the 7 seasonals, and that's for 25 weeks, so this would cover them for the other 27, 29 weeks that they would be employed if we've done our math right. And then we'd also like to purchase a vehicle, and we've gone sort of on the high end on that. The vehicle may come under that, but we'd like to get a 2-wheel drive utility truck, and Public Works is estimating that total cost, in the vicinity of $30,000 to $35,000. So we've made the ask for a budget supplemental of $35,000 in regards to that. And then the next ask is, is this strategy, is this approach for 2015? Does this work for you as elected officials? Does this give you some of what you've asked for in regards to staff, or are there some other areas that you want us to explore?
I had a question over there, right here, Mr. Pond.
Yeah, question, and I guess I'll hold comments, but specifically, if you could talk a little bit about the transition of the 7 seasonal positions, and I want to focus on something that you have here in the handout regarding Parks Patrol and Enforcement, and the fact that the 2 contingent positions would not be on that that task or those tasks. So just kind of a 2-part question. What are those tasks that when you say Parks Patrol and Enforcement, what kind of tasks have been taking place by those 7 seasonal positions? And as we transition to the 5+2, how do you ensure that you're gonna continue to service those tasks at the level that you have been, and or to increase that as the need arises?
Thanks. So Mary and Jim, you can come up here too, but let me try to cover this, and then if I get wrong or you want to add something to that, please do. So last year when we had the 7 seasonals, so we're not talking really about changing the 7 seasonal positions. We're not adding any additional positions. We're simply taking 2 of those 7, and we're extending their time, and we're focusing their time to this effort. So last year, what worked best for us was to take 2 of those seasonal positions and really devote them to the parks. So we still had our full-time employees spending time in the parks, But we were able to take those two seasonals and direct them to certain days and days of the week and times to deal with some of our problem parks. So, you know, Discovery Park is one of those parks. It's a beautiful park. It really gets used, but there tends to be generational issues there between the skateboarders, young kids, parents, and our seniors. So they were able to work at that location, be posted at that location, patrol that park, interact with you know, the people that use the park and our skateboarders, and if they saw violations, you know, deal with those from an educational perspective, and if it really came down to it, was a chronic offender, you know, call somebody in to help with issuing a citation or making an arrest if that was necessary, and that occurred rarely, if at all. In addition, we could use them in some of our other parks. So the Greenbelt, we could focus the efforts down there at certain times of the day. Paramount Park, you know, some, you know, Stites Park, you know, some of those parks where we might have issues with transients or, you know, people abusing the park. So we don't see that changing. We'll still use our existing resources to sort of provide, you know, that parks piece that we need, and our other existing resources are full-time employees to deal with some of that. So.
All right, well, that's perfect, because that's.
She tells me I do a great job.
No, I know. I'm really trying to get her. Well, that's great, and I think specifically as some of the things that I've heard, I think continuing to work, for instance, on Discovery Park is going to be important. And then I'll just kind of let this hang out there, you know, along those lines, and maybe I'd have to look at the analysis a little bit better. But Kipling Corridor didn't show up as one of these commercial corridors, and I suppose there's a data-driven reason for that, although I'd be interested in talking about that, because as we have new development or interest in development along Kipling and you know, things like Discovery Park and all of that, you know, I might want to position that for something in the near future where we are able to focus on Kipling as one of these corridors in a similar way that you've suggested in this document.
So if you looked at some of the data, just you know, to sort of address that, you really see a lot of our nuisance code violations tend to be more heavily involved in the older parts of our city. Further west you get, they tend to drop off a little bit. But that I-70 and Kipling corridor, which could potentially be one of these areas additionally, might be an area that you might you know, look at. And that could be you know, your Kipling corridor, could be your 44th corridor there. We're trying to find two areas that we think have some fairly significant problems, and to try to see if we can get some wins there, and what those wins might cost us or what those might look like, because then that'll give us a strategy to move forward to 2016. And I sort of envision this as an annual sort of process where community development, public works to a certain degree, and the PD are getting together and providing information to you in regards to strategies every year to deal with, you know, certain areas of the city, and those certainly, I think we all understand, can change for a lot of different reasons.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Thank you, guys. I have a couple of questions. What arrows do we have in our quiver for businesses that essentially have no landscaping or don't maintain landscaping? For example, we have along Wadsworth, for example, we have businesses that have nothing but pavement, no beautification of any kind. Is that a violation of the code or not?
I'll let Ken take it the first swag at it.
You know, I think it varies, and that's where the research comes in. You know, there's some instances, a reasonably high number of instances where you look at a site, and I won't pick one, but and they're lacking landscaping, and you say, well, is that permissible? And you find out that actually no, it's not. That, you know, in 1982 we approved a landscape plan for that property that was supposed to be irrigated and have sod and trees and shrubs, and they just gradually neglected them, or they blocked a sign and they took them down. That's not uncommon that comes up. The challenge with that is in terms of, what quivers, what arrows we have. I mean, it's a hard conversation to have. It's a hard conversation to start, particularly if you go back and you look at aerial photography and it turns out they haven't had that landscaping in 20 years or 10 years. And, the property's changed hands. And, all of a sudden we're knocking on their door and with a $30,000 bill, and they need to get irrigation to it. It's a hard conversation to have. So that isn't uncommon. And in other instances, you would go to a property and say, well, they don't have any landscaping, and it turns out when they built the property, they didn't have to. And, so you don't really have much of an enforcement conversation to have with them. Now, would there be an opportunity to say, hey, we've got a grant program if you want to install landscaping and help beautify the, I think that's this amped up program is the things you might start thinking about of saying, we actually would like landscaping on the Wadsworth corridor, and even though you weren't required to, we'd like to offer an opportunity that you could partner with the city, maybe with a matching grant to install it. But on the other ones where they are actually required to install it, it takes a lot of follow-up. It takes certainly some money from them to get it done. And, I think in the spirit of cooperation, which we always try and demonstrate, we're not going to come down with a real heavy hammer. I mean, we're going to try and work through it just like Mary's group always does, but it's going to involve more involvement from my team as well. You can utilize some of the existing Wheat Ridge Business District grants towards some of those landscape improvements. They have recalibrated their grant and loan programs, I think, so that you can use those sources of funding for both landscaping and ADA accessibility improvements, which was a change made in the last couple of years as well. Okay.
Those are limited though.
They are.
Yeah, so you probably wouldn't cover those in some cases. My concern is not so much the neighbors we're talking about. I am concerned with the overall look of the city. I would like to see more concentration of businesses, especially on Wadsworth. I think Wadsworth is the most it's the street that most people drive through Wheat Ridge on. I think that gives the impression of the city is what you see in Wadsworth. Now, I know we're hoping for a grant for that. And in connection with that project ends the 35th, and I would like to suggest that at least our enforcement includes Wadsworth and starts instead at 32nd. Because there are some pretty bad places between 32nd and 35th. And I would hate to see us do a project, sort of have a beautiful street that suddenly ends in an unhappy looking place. So I'd like to extend Wadsworth that way. And my last question, the full-time equivalents. Oh, I thought that was on. They're full-time, you're seeing them as full-time people. So they're actually doing the job of an employee full-time, 8 hours a day, but not being paid, not receiving benefits.
They would work 30 hours a week, so they're part-time. So we'd get 60 hours from 2 positions a week out of that, and they would not be benefited. Part of the contract with us would be, we're going to pay X amount an hour. You'll work this number of hours a week, and it's a non-benefited position. We looked at adding, making them just part-time employees, and that would, and Jim, I don't know if you have the figures on that, but it seemed to me it was over $30,000 a year. So $60,000 total, $30,000 an employee a year, $60,000 total to, for the benefits piece of that. It was a pretty significant amount of money. So this approach, I think, gives us the opportunity to get 60 hours a week from 2 non-benefited contingent contract employees. And if this process doesn't work, we don't have to worry about what are we going to do with them next. Gives us the opportunity to go from year to year, and if it does work, then we can have that conversation about, do we add them full-time? So it was one of those tough cost-cutting kinds of ways to look at addressing it.
plus a car, right?
plus a vehicle.
That's what the truck is for, those?
Truck would be for those employees to use.
And is the truck also equipped with dog catcher?
No, that's why the cost, if you remember that vehicle, that cargo van that we asked for with all the equipment was about a $45,000 expense. So we're not gonna outfit it with that. We'll use it strictly for, this work, and we'll also be able to use it for some of our parks enforcement work, because they won't need the parks or the
So
animal
we would
control piece.
support putting the truck back in the budget and the time.
So we're looking at a total of about 62,000 to put into the
Yes.
budget for those two items.
In that regard, excuse me, one more thing. What is to prevent us from paying mileage and having people drive their own vehicle?
You know, it's tough to do when you're asking people to do enforcement-related things. They'd have a portable radio, but they wouldn't have an actual radio. If they saw, an emergency out there, they wouldn't have emergency equipment in their personal car. And the other thing is when you start asking people to do enforcement-related work, and they tell their insurance company, I'm driving my personal car to do this enforcement stuff, oftentimes they can't find coverage because they don't want them out there doing that, so.
Mr. Urban had a question.
To follow up on that sort of workflow process, is the report that's filed, is that filed in the field or in the office as it relates to a complaint that's made?
So it could be both. They have computers in their vehicles. They can do some of the reports in the vehicles while they're working. If they have time between calls for service, or they'll do reports and phone calls and follow up in the station. So it works both ways. They do the same kind of work that our patrol officers do.
And does that have any integration with mobile GIS, or what kind of information does the officer have with them as they're pulling up to a property? I guess my question is, as an officer pulls up to the property, do they know who the property owner is? What's that packet of information look like that they have at their ready? I recently filed a report, and the officer didn't have the pictures that I had forwarded along. So I'm just kind of curious as to what information that officer is given as they pull up to the property, and then if a complaint is made, does that complaint, is it relegated to that specific issue? Or is there a checklist or something that officer then goes through and says, we received a complaint, however, here's our other categories we need to look at? What type of
So
process is
there are
that?
two ways that that this happens. One would be, the officer's driving down the street and sees a violation, so he just pulls over, tells dispatch, I'm going to be out at 7500 West 29th Avenue, and if they want, they can actually run through the computer, sort of a history on that address. They generally don't do that. They generally don't have the time to do it. They'll just make that initial contact, see what information they can get, then they can come back and do research. If there's nobody home, they can get call the county. They can look at different computer databases, our records management system, to get information on the who resides, their property owner, phone numbers, and those kinds of things. So that's that sort of proactive sort of approach. So that's one way that they might handle it. The other is if a call comes, so there's a variety of different ways a call might come in. A call might come to me from an elected official, and I give that to Mary, and Mary assigns that to dispatcher. The dispatcher advises, or the code enforcement officer advises dispatch. They're out at that particular residence. They may have the opportunity to run some information, but it's just sort of the basic kinds of stuff. They'll call out at an address. If there's an alert on that address, for safety reasons, that always comes up when they call out. So they always call out at an address when they're out doing that stuff. So they get those alert kinds of things. Most of the research, quite frankly, is done at the at the back end. It's that proactive work when they see something, or that complaint's coming to us through different avenues. Somebody's calling our comm center, an elected official's calling me or Mary to deal with that. We get a service request in our computer system that requires us to go out. And sometimes, you're right. I mean, if you've attached pictures to that, those may not have gone to somebody in the field. They may have gotten a phone call that said, hey, go check this address, and we've got a complaint of weeds, trash, or debris. They may not have that other information. So.
And I've just seen some other cities that have used a more integrated mobile GIS, so everything's available to the officer at that time, as well as my next question is related to the follow-up with the complainant, or I don't know if that's the proper term, but the person making the complaint, to show them that this issue has been resolved, or some way to sort of close that issue ticket out with the person who filed that complaint, I think would help them understand that this is something that's been addressed, or how do we follow up on
So we
this?
always try to do that if that person wants to be recontacted. Lots of times, somebody will call in, Ken calls in and says, I've got a problem with this property, would you check it out? And I want to be anonymous. I don't want to sign a complaint, I just want to give that to you. So, in those kinds of cases, unless they request contact from us, we won't do contact. Oftentimes, particularly with service requests and those kinds of things, we try to follow up. When you're dealing with, a couple thousand of those a year, in addition to animal control calls, parks things, I'm sure that we, miss the mark in terms of trying to contact them. But Mary is very customer service oriented and tries to make those calls. One of the issues that we do have with our current technology, from a mobile GIS perspective, and we can look a little bit more into that from a mapping perspective, is we have a limited amount of data that we can pull over on our wireless system because of the contract we have. So there are some databases that we're not able to use, but we can certainly look into the GIS piece as a database and look at how that might apply to the jobs that they're doing there.
Okay. And then there's been at least one property near Harlan that, I don't know the entire story, but my understanding was there was an issue with gaining access to the property to fully, not necessarily inspect, but otherwise inspect the entire property itself. You're only looking at it from the street. You're not able to.
Right.
So
It happens quite a bit. So we don't have the authority to go on to somebody's property and inspect like the backyard where there might be a violation. I mean, certainly if we have things in plain view, that means I can see it, I can deal with those kinds of things. So
Let's try to get back to the,
let me finish it.
that is part
Finish
of
the
the
question though. So what we have to do is we have to get a neighbor to allow us access, give us permission to be there so we can look over. Unless it's a safety, an exigent kind of circumstance where from a safety perspective, we've got to make entry, the Fourth Amendment applies. So people are,
But wouldn't you have, if a property appears to be abandoned from the street, wouldn't that give you?
well, you have to be able to articulate that.
I
mean,
can
just
point out a couple
the
properties that
appearance
are abandoned.
is not gonna win a case in court. You're gonna have to be able to show that it's abandoned. So there's a process from a Fourth Amendment perspective. All people are have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures by the police. So that would be one of those situations. So we have to do the research, on that. Or if there's a violation in the back that we can't see, either a neighbor's got to allow us access, or we've got to go through the process of getting consent, to do that entry. So we do a really good job with that for the most part. But it does delay the investigation into that sometimes because you have to make contact with others.
And on this note, I recently filed a complaint regarding Martinson Elementary School. There were several broken out windows that have been boarded up, nevertheless, but they're still broken out windows. And I think that relates to this issue in the sense that when you have a property across the street from neighbors who are expected to maintain their property and there's broken windows across the street, that's a virus that spreads through the community, and then that you have more broken windows. And so I'd like to see if there's several key properties throughout the community that are either totally blighted, that we have some process to fast track that or track it through to condemnation. To when was the last time we condemned a property that was abandoned or blighted, and understanding better what types of steps are we taking, or are we just not using all the tools that we have available to us? So I'd like to see that as a part of this, that there's some teeth there, that if this property isn't maintained, then it will be condemned, and it will use the tools that we have available. And that's just
So we do a lot of, and not a lot, but we do a number of abatements, a year. Those are pretty expensive.
Sure.
Okay. We've dealt with a couple of properties, one on Yarrow Street, one over off of Kipling Street, where, we've, both Ken's crew and our crew, and Public Works, in one case, we had violations across all of those different areas. We were able to get the property owners to start to to correct the violations. But some of them take a while because the violations are so extensive. And some we do abatements. And those abatements, you know, we had one a few years ago, it was about $15,000. That's the city paying that to get it abated, just to get it up to a standard where you don't have a safety, health, or welfare kind of issue. I'm not aware of, in my tenure as a chief, where we've condemned a property. That's a court process. It's got a pretty high standard to it.
What I'm hearing is you're a very busy, very busy
Comes with
code
the
enforcement. And the additional help has increased a lot more, completed calls, et cetera, which what I'm wanting to know is, does that, I hear you, Mr. DiTullio. What we have to come up with a decision we're looking for is, do we want to add more to those tools, since it seems to be working successfully? I've also heard Mr. Fitzgerald would like to be more in tune to the commercial areas, which we'll be addressing somewhat. This will introduce that. So I'm just trying to keep us going on down the path we need to go here today, or tonight. And Mr. DiTullio, you wanted to comment?
So I do support amending the budget for the $27,000 for the contract employees. I'd like to see that move forward. I also support the $35,000 for the vehicle, for code enforcement. Code enforcement obviously is near and dear to my heart. I've had a lot of experience with it in 19 years. I think they do a good job, and I think these 2 extra employees, contract employees, would benefit the entire city, not just certain areas. But I would rather see us focus on the 44th Avenue corridor. That's been identified as a problem for quite a while. You said Sheridan to Wadsworth or Harlan to
Would be
Wadsworth?
Harlan. So
Okay.
our property picks up, our jurisdiction picks up at Harlan.
Because that's residential and commercial in that area. Plus, you know, Wadsworth is going to be changing based on the Pell grants and the studies. You may see demolition of entire corners or properties in the future. So we may be doing enforcement there, and that's going to get cleaned up anyway, hopefully. So I would rather see us focus on 44th based on the recommendations from the police department. And so that would be my consensus to move forward. If we do ask for a consensus, I support both budget amendments.
Mr. Starker?
Chief, I'd like to thank you for bringing this forward. This is very, I think, a really worthwhile type of program for our city. And I have had the opportunity over the last several years to see firsthand the East Wheat Ridge project and hear from my neighbors in that part of the city. And I think we've made great strides. And we've made great strides both in upgrading the neighborhood. We've made even better strides in developing community and people understanding who their neighbors are in police and community relations. And I think it's been a positive sort of win-win all the way around. As I run the math, it sounds like we've got 27 for some employees, and we've got 35 for a vehicle, for somewhere between 60 and 65. Let me ask you, is there any, have you gone through your budget to see if there's any sort of available resources in the current city police budget that may defer any of this cost, so that we're not sort of taking it 100% out of sort of unfunded resources, or can we find any money anywhere else to help pay for the program?
We have absolutely looked through our budget, to find, those dollars. As we've talked about before, we've got a pretty lean budget. About 93% of our budget is salaries and benefits for our employees, and a significant portion of the rest of our budget is dollars that we pay for some of the services that we get, like the Foothills Animal Shelter, crime lab services, a lot of, a juvenile assessment center, a lot of those sort of contractual kinds of things we have, and then the rest is just the basic operating supplies that we need. So, I'm sure I could find 1,000 here or 1,000 there, but probably not the money to cover this particular, project. At the end of every year, the reality is we turn back a pretty significant sum of money from a salary savings perspective, but going into every year, we're not sure what that picture is going to look like, and those are vacant salaries, so we certainly give our share of money back to the city that's not used. We don't
Always glad to have you spend the money wisely, and for everyone to know that we don't kind of have any sacred cows, and everybody's got to come to the budget, acts.
Code enforcement is my sacred cow.
Well, I would, I don't know, we've set up a discussion. I would sort of make a consensus that we move forward with funding these two items in the sort of $60,000 to $65,000 range, and we continue with these. You know, I don't know how you want to tweak the residential commercial corridors, and I don't know if we need to be that specific, and maybe so.
I'd agree with that. I think we could focus on the areas later. But that's actually $67,000. Yeah, 27 plus 35, or 62, never mind. Yeah, okay. 62, so 62,000, I'd support that.
I would support that.
And then what we'll do as community development, the police department, is we'll try to keep council updated on those areas that we identify and move forward on.
Very good, sounds like a great program.
This is what you asked for, so just trying to fit that into everything else we're doing. So.
Thank you, Chief Brennan.
Thank you.
Actually, you've always do a great job.
Thanks, Mary. Jim, Kim.
Yep. Thank you very much. I think, being as this time of year, I doubt if there's any elected official reports, but are there any that somebody would like to say something or whatever?
Well,
Yeah, Mr. DiTullio.
Madam Mayor, it's my understanding that it's not just elected official reports, but it's actually elected official comments. I think we should be doing both at a study session as well, because that's part of our job, to communicate with each other. We're not communicating now often off the dais. I think that the intent was elected official reports would be also elected official comments.
Fine.
And so what I'd like to do is, we've had some discussion about this electric fence around a business in the city of Wheat Ridge. And I guess right now, electric fences that are commercially safe electric fences that, for safety reasons, are not defined in our code. And I think the staff's been trying to work. I think we need to go a step further, and I guess per the council rules, we're allowed to add something to the agenda. And so I think, Mr. Urban, I would like to add for the next meeting on January 12th, just a motion directing the city attorney to draft up the ordinance to amend our code to allow for electric fences, commercial grade electric fences. And then if that motion passes, then they would go out and staff would draft the ordinance. And so the city attorney I talked to him over the weekend, he said basically, I need direction, he needs direction from council on the dais, and then if that passed, then we would draft the ordinance. But by the council rules, we can add it to the agenda at least, and then discuss it Monday night. If it fails, it fails. If it passes, it passes. But I'll feel, and I think other council people will feel, that we've at least heard the issue with one business. And this may be an issue in the future with other local businesses that want to put this type of commercial electric fence up. So by council rules, Mr. Urban, I would like to add that to the agenda for the 12th. Just a motion to direct the city attorney to draft it, and then if it fails, it's done. So,
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I think in this particular instance, what we've come up with is not an undue burden on this particular landowner. And they were given the opportunity to respond and didn't respond. And that's their fault. That's not the city's fault, and it's not the code's fault. If they don't respond, what are you going to do? There's nothing unreasonable about what we're asking.
well, you can say that Monday night when we make the motion to ask staff to draft the ordinance. You don't want to vote for it, don't. But I think it's kind of interesting that you're afraid of making sex offenders pay $25 fee because it's overregulation, and then this is not considered overregulation when we're trying to have a business protect their property with a commercial grade type of solution.
Wait, that's starting to sound personal. So let's stay with the. You know what I mean, as far as referring to the other council members' choices and decisions and commentary about dissimilar items. That's what I mean, is sounding personal. And let's try to stay with the question in hand, which is whether to bring that forward to our council.
Madam Mayor, by council rules, we've added it to the agenda for the 12th, Mr. Urban and I. So we can vote on it that night.
Right.
Yes, you
So
can.
there is no question, and this is and I accept your comment that this is a comment period, so let's just keep it as comments. Let's not have back and forth. We're not debating anything. If that, you made a comment, we're done.
So as I understand it, then your request, and two counselors can ask to add an item. So as I understand it, the item would be to add a discussion about,
No, the item would be a motion to direct, it'd be a regular agenda item. And then the motion would just simply say, I move to direct the city attorney to draft up the ordinance to allow commercial grade electric fences in the city of Wheat Ridge to amend our code. That's all it says. If it passes, then staff would draft the ordinance and bring it forward. If it fails, then we're done.
so you want to have a motion or an item at the next meeting to take a vote whether or not to direct the city
Right.
attorney to draft
Then we could debate it, and people are going to say, no, they like it, or yes, they don't. And then
Well, I don't have the council rules here, but it.
I think that's
it appears-
reasonable. I think
we
that's
can- I
reasonable.
think we can do that, yeah. I don't see a problem with that.
There is another, is there anyone else has any comments, because there's one I want to add as well. We have had kind of held up there, or haven't made an official decision as far as the animal control board, and chief is here. I think we need to put that on our agenda as an affirmative, make a decision. Are we going to disband that board? Are we going to continue with it? It just seems like it's fair. And I need someone else to join me in that. It seems like it's fair treatment to those board members as to whether we're going to continue that. So can we add that to the agenda as well?
Would you like to add this to a study session agenda or to a council agenda?
Studied it.
Okay, so you would like to add a motion to sunset that commission? Okay. Okay, and I have the mayor and I have Mr. Pond, and I believe that's a proper motion, and that will be added to the agenda.
are you asking for the ordinance or just the motion to draft? Because to disband, I believe you have to do it by ordinance.
Yeah, it would be, yeah.
We need to have a study session on it.
Well, no, I don't, I think we've studied it.
Talk to the city attorney, and we'll bring back the necessary actions that need to be brought back.
Well, but that's a different item. Are we asking to have a motion at the next meeting to direct the city attorney to draft a sunset motion or a sunset ordinance?
Yeah, and yeah, we can do that
So
too.
let's do that both
Yeah,
as,
okay.
okay?
Thank you. Sorry.
No.
Now, I have a question. I want to be clear about this, Mr. Starker. What you're describing is just a generic motion to sunset commissions, correct?
Well, this,
And what she had asked for was to disband the animal control. And you're making it more generic sounding.
no, I don't mean to, pardon me if I am. What I'm asking for is a motion to direct the city attorney to bring back an ordinance sunsetting the Animal Control Commission.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that accurately reflect? Okay.